In the first chapter of The Queer Art of Failure, queer theorist Jack Halberstam proposes the concept of Pixar volts, the idea that 3D animated movies like Chicken Run, Over the Hedge, Finding Nemo, Robots, or Happy Feet have an unusual inclination towards revolutionary theming. Though he calls them Pixar volts, Halberstam doesn't distinguish between the differing creative approaches of different animation studios. Every movie I just mentioned came from a different studio. Then on page 49, Halberstam calls B-Movie a Pixar production. I'm gonna let that sink in for a second. 3D animated films are inescapable, hugely profitable, and the vehicles of massive pop culture phenomena like the Minions or Frozen. But except for those who take an active interest in animation, the nuances and hallmarks of different studios don't usually go identified by the average viewer.
Inside Out is DreamWorks. It's not. DreamWorks, man, I'm Googling it.
You don't need to Google it.
Oh yeah, it is Pixar. What a surprise!
Not everybody watching this is going to get what I find so funny about someone thinking Pixar made B-Movie. But with that said, there is a surface-level understanding among general audiences and critics that there is a difference between the films produced and distributed by different studios. In his book Fantasy Animation: Connections Between Media, Mediums, and Genres, Christopher Holliday describes the releases of Pixar's Brave and Disney's Wreck-It Ralph, which followed the Disney-Pixar merger in 2006. Based on the reactions people had to Wreck-It Ralph as feeling more like a Pixar film, and Brave as feeling more like a Disney princess movie, Holliday demonstrates that
certain definable features and pre-sold pleasures are attributable and recognized by critics and audiences as belonging to specific animation studios.
But I'd say that in spite of this perceived reversal of archetypes between Brave and Wreck-It Ralph, and even taking into account the blurring of lines between studio approaches given Pixar's John Lasseter and Edwin Catmull's time as Chief Creative Officer and President at Walt Disney Animation Studios, I'm pretty sure I could have told you Wreck-It Ralph wasn't Pixar, and Brave wasn't Disney. The Pixar-esque element of Wreck-It Ralph that Holliday mentions is the Toy Story-style secret life of video game characters it shows, while Brave is Disneyfied because it's a fairy tale narrative with a princess in the lead. These comparisons take into account only as much as you'd glean from a one-sentence plot synopsis of the films. It doesn't consider the difference in execution, the fact that Pixar and Disney, and DreamWorks, Illumination, Sony, and Blue Sky, pour one out, don't just make different films. They make films differently. Disney can tell a Pixar-esque story, but they still don't tell it the way Pixar would. So how can you identify what studio made an animated film? There's plenty of technique and minutiae you could point to, but I'm going to talk about 4 key identifying factors where Pixar and DreamWorks represent the far ends of a spectrum, and the other studios fall in between. 4 questions about any given movie. Is it soft or hard? Is it more about family or about individualism? Are the world and narrative it constructs believable or farcical? And are the characters cute or ugly? First, let's tackle soft or hard. In her article, The Cultural Politics of Softness, Andy Schwartz defines softness as
a general orientation to the world that foregrounds vulnerability, emotionality, and earnestness. This stands in contrast to hardness, an approach that often relies on irony and sarcasm to shore up the image of infallible impenetrability.
It shouldn't come as a surprise that Pixar is, by this definition, very soft. See? Movies like Luca, WALL-E, and Up are as earnest and vulnerable as they come. Pixar's movies seek to hit a personal emotional chord with people, and succeed to enough of a degree that they're famous for how much they make you cry.
Remember that famous Pixar lunch we had? You know, the one where we came up with a bunch of ideas for our first movies? Well, we did it again, but for sad
That video's a joke, but given the Spark Short series that Pixar's been putting out lately, I'm unconvinced they didn't actually do this.
Why can't you just be normal?
Fun for the whole family. Pixar's Inside Out is about 11-year-old Riley's pubescent emotional confusion when her family moves. I moved when I was 12. This scene where Riley collapses on the floor crying happened to me. This movie destroyed me in theaters. And for as much as Pixar matches Andy Schwartz's definition of softness, DreamWorks in equal measure matches her definition of hardness as impenetrable sarcasm. All 4 of their Shrek movies did better at the box office than anything else they've ever made. Parody works for them. In their chapter on DreamWorks in the book That's All Folks, Eco-Critical Readings of American Animated Features, Robin L. Murray and Joseph K. Heumann point out that irreverence is important enough to DreamWorks that they included it in their mission statement on their website. Murray and Heumann posit that this irreverence is what primarily sets them apart from Disney, by which they mean Pixar. So if Pixar is soft and DreamWorks is hard, let's quickly place the other major 3D animation studios onto that spectrum. I'm going to be referring to Disney, specifically their post-Tangled output, rather than their awkward era of 3D puberty with Chicken Little, The Wild, Meet the Robinsons, and Bolt, or their long history of 2D animation, as well as Sony, Illumination, and Blue Sky, pour one out. In spite of their relationship with Pixar, I think Disney falls closer to the hard side of this spectrum. Characters like Hero in Big Hero 6 or Ralph from Wreck-It Ralph do have room for emotionally vulnerable moments, but these are predominantly light movies with much more sarcasm and vulgar humor than Pixar.
You lying, slimy son of a...
And more of a focus on adventure than feelings. Sony is similar. There are emotional moments to be found, but they take a backseat to hyperactive comedy and spectacle. Illumination is interesting because their first film, Despicable Me, had a significant softness to it.
Though while you sleep, we are apart. Your mommy loves you with all her heart. The end, okay, good night.
It doesn't come close to overwhelming its hard focus on comedy, but it's still significant. It's why I remember enjoying Despicable Me. But then kids like the Minions, and now everything they make is hard. And finally, Blue Sky, pour one out. Again, some softness to be found in something like Ice Age, but...
Your baby, and this is my milk.
I thought you were a female!
This is, it's, not soft. In that chapter on DreamWorks, Murray and Heumann believe that DreamWorks' deeply valued philosophical irreverence leads to a fundamentally different output than Pixar on an ideological level. As an example of this, they go on to discuss DreamWorks' preoccupation with individualism, which leads me to my second way of distinguishing studios. They point specifically to Ants as advocating for individuality in the midst of conformist culture and oppressive social hierarchies. But I would say that almost all of their films have be yourself as a prominent theme, because be yourself is inoffensive and can be slotted into any story that presents an outcast or a ragtag group of outcasts and is primarily doing so because it's funny. But what about Pixar? In his chapter on Pixar Volts, Jack Halberstam says,
"In Finding Nemo, the most valuable lesson that Nemo learns is not to be himself or to follow his dreams, but to think with others and to work for a more collective futurity."
Murray and Heumann echo this, saying, Pixar films challenge the American notion of individualism on which the pioneer spirit of the frontier was built. Get it? Because there's two of them. Pixar movies aren't just about being yourself. Except for The Incredibles.
There are special people like us who should run the world, and then there's normies like Oren who deliver our pizza and fight our wars. Haven't you seen The Incredibles?
I don't give a flying fuck about The Incredibles!
Most of Pixar's movies, even the Randian Incredibles, are about family or parental relationships. Think Coco, Monsters Inc., Up, Finding Nemo, Onward. As a result of this, Pixar is far more likely than the other studios to have a child as a main character, because childhood is inherently vulnerable, and you can't cast an adult celebrity as a child. Unless you do. Pixar's children exist in relation to a parental figure, who is more often than not the protagonist and usually not a literal parent, or in relation to their place in a family. So if we're taking Pixar's familial and parental relationships as the stark contrast to DreamWorks' be-yourself individualist approach, let's place the other studios on that spectrum. Disney is about as focused on individualism as DreamWorks, but with an edge of self-discovery and focus on identity that sets it apart. Incidentally, Disney has the highest proportion of female central characters, with 7 out of their 11 movies post-Tangled having a female main protagonist, 64%, while everyone else has on average 3, or 12% of their movies. Anyway, Sony and Illumination both have more comedic protagonists, like DreamWorks, but both still wind up with more movies about family, or whatever the hell Minions are. And as far as I can discern without watching it, Sing doesn't seem to even have a main character. So let's slot them in closer to Pixar. Blue Sky, pour one out is similar. They're not exactly preoccupied with either families or staunchly individual protagonists. They've got a bit of both. Alright, on to our next question. Is the world and narrative of the film believable or farcical? All of these studios cast celebrities to voice their characters, but the ways they handle them are very different. Pixar mostly casts famous actors, while DreamWorks casts more famous comedians. The result is that Pixar's characters feel more like performances.
I didn't ask for any of this!
In another book from Christopher Holliday, The Computer Animated Film Industry, Style, and Genre, he emphasizes the uniquely performative quality of Pixar's films, and points out that acting is a necessary component of the curriculum at the Pixar University. The job of an animator can sometimes be comparable to the job of an actor.
So there's no dance choreographer in these movies, that's you guys.
Yeah, that's just me dancing in a room of mirrors to kind of figure it out.
But after setting up the idea of animator as actor, Holliday establishes that it's more complex than that.
The performance of animation is rarely singular, but a highly complex enterprise involving a plurality of creative personnel, including directors, animators, and voice artists operating within separately defined spheres of labor. Each phase refines and develops that which precedes it, continually recombining and transforming the character's performance.
Pretty much every animated character is going to be a performance combined from different creative elements, but different studios weigh these inputs differently. Pixar's characters, while played by recognizable celebrities, are still well-defined characters separate from those people. That's why they're able to make something like their Pixar popcorn shorts where there's no voice dubbing whatsoever. But DreamWorks' approach is more akin to puppetry, as Holliday later describes it.
The star throws their voice through the technologically mediated act of ventriloquism into these computer-animated puppets, who momentarily borrow it on loan. Such is the potency of star speech that it works against the concealment of the dubbing process that is fundamental to the vocal performances across the genre and is accepted by spectators rather than rejected.
I think puppet is a good term for the way DreamWorks characters work, because oftentimes the comedians playing them aren't so much performing them as speaking through them, lending their personality and ad-libbing jokes. Holliday uses the term anthropomorphic synchrosis to describe animated characters with a star's voice that are also given the star's primary physical features, skilled vocation, or elements of their persona, albeit playfully channeled through the genre's anthropomorphic register. This is usually the case with DreamWorks protagonists. Poe is just Jack Black, Marty is just Chris Rock, Will Smith Fish is just Will Smith, but Fish.
You know they have a Larry King in the human world, too.
It's a common name. Next week on Be Larry King.
No, I mean, he looks like you, and he has a show with suspenders and different colored dots behind him.
Next week on Be Larry
Got
King.
old guy glasses, and there's quotes along the bottom from the guest you're watching, even though you just heard him.
Bear Week next week. They're scary, they're hairy, and they're here live.
Always leans forward, pointy shoulders, squinty eyes, very Jewish.
Pour one out. Holliday goes on to discuss anthropomorphic synchrosis as it relates to the character design in DreamWorks' Shark Tale, but we'll get back to character design in just a minute. These characters that rely on the extra filmic persona of the celebrities providing their voices are in line with the broader pattern that DreamWorks doesn't remotely care about suspension of disbelief in their movies. It doesn't matter how absurd the trajectory of the story is because everything in the film is in service of being funny. As an example of this, Holliday describes the DreamWorks logo sequence as
a reflection of the creative visions of its founders Steven Spielberg, Jeffrey Katzenberg, and Dave Geffen. For Chuck Robinson, the image of the half moon over water with a small child cradled therein holds strong maternal undertones. Warren Buckland, on the other hand, claims the inspiring image evokes facets of the American ideal, arguing that the emotional experience that DreamWorks is attempting to convey is an idealistic, sentimental Norman Rockwell-type image of America, that is, another universal image of lost childhood innocence.
They then beat the shit out of the child.
Hey!
Not even the literal icon of the creator's authorial intentions, nor the breaking of the fourth wall inherent in subverting it, is as important to DreamWorks as a good gag. And it is a good gag. Shit's funny. So, on Pixar's end, believable. On DreamWorks' end, farcical. Disneyland's very near to Pixar in this category, only offset slightly by their refusal to engage in period or character accuracy.
Have you ever done like a group project, but there's like that one kid who didn't pitch in as much, but still ended up with the same grade?
This has been the case ever since The Little Mermaid, or arguably earlier, as far back as something like The Jungle Book. Regardless of whether we're in 19th century Scandinavia, Polynesia 2,000 years ago, or Southeast Asia whenever Raya and the Last Dragon is meant to be set, everyone always talks like modern Americans. Disney's characters make jokes that they shouldn't be able to make, like the pop culture references of Robin Williams' Genie, this painful line in Moana.
When you use a bird to write with, it's called tweeting.
Or this gag in Wreck-It Ralph.
Name Lara Croft. Name Wreck-It Ralph.
Ralph lives in an arcade. There's no reason for him to know what Tomb Raider is.
Wifey?
But the gag takes precedence over believability. Sony, I'm going to slide over slightly further, because of the fourth wall bending reflexivity of Into the Spider-Verse and Mitchell's vs. the Machines. But also, shout out to the mockumentary style of Surf's Up, where the camera exists concretely and interacts with the environment. Go watch Surf's Up. It's good. And Blue Sky and Illumination are both fairly believable, but with a sprinkling of very absurd plot points for the purpose of comedy. Something like Gru stealing the moon. And with that, we come to the final question to identify which animation studio made a movie. Are the characters cute or ugly? This spectrum has a more clear midpoint than the others, that being funny looking. But I think DreamWorks tends to overshoot that, and as a result, they often land in ugly. Pixar's characters are cute. Big pupils, round edges. Pretty much every Pixar character looks safe for a kid to hug. Disney's characters mix this cuteness with the more naturalistic but idealized prettiness of the Disney princess art style. Blue Sky is really interesting in this category. Unique to them is a pattern of strong 2D influence on their character design, especially noticeable in something like Robots, but also in Ice Age, Spies in Disguise, and, of course, the Peanuts movie. Illumination also fits the funny-looking category, often using much smaller pupils than the other studios, which makes its characters feel more cartoony and less cute. Also, a lot of their characters are shaped like an 8. I don't know what's up with that. Maybe they find fat people funny? I don't know. Same with Sony. Something like the Emoji Movie isn't exactly cute, and Hotel Transylvania's character designs are very cartoony and in line with the rest of Jendy Tartakovsky's work, solidly landing in funny looking. And then you get to DreamWorks. Calling their art style ugly sounds harsh, but it isn't always detrimental. Ugly is just an extreme form of funny looking, and something like Shrek is very intentionally ugly. Something like Megamind is made funnier by ugliness. But then in something like Shark Tale or B-Movie, the ugliness is in part a result of the anthropomorphic synchrosis of trying to work the likenesses of real people into cartoon animal character designs. But overall, when you look at characters from something like Monsters vs. Aliens, you can't help but think that DreamWorks revels in making characters that are just deeply unpleasant to look at. Kinda like 90s Nickelodeon, or your wildcard friend doodling in the 3rd grade. So, cute or ugly, believable or farcical, family or individual, soft or hard. By asking ourselves these questions, it becomes much easier to pick up on patterns in studio output and become familiar with the distinct styles of every oeuvre. Of course, there's always outliers. DreamWorks' How to Train Your Dragon feels more adventure than comedy, and their Mr. Peabody and Sherman feels cuter and more family-focused than usual. Pixar's got Cars 2, which isn't exactly soft, and Sony's Vivo acts more as a DreamWorks-style vehicle for Lin-Manuel Miranda's persona and skill set than their other movies usually do. But in How to Train Your Dragon, Hiccup is very much an outcast who isn't like everyone else around him and in the end remains himself. Mr. Peabody and Sherman has an over-the-top narrative and density of jokes that wouldn't fit in a Pixar movie. Cars 2 takes itself too seriously to really work as the light spy comedy it should be, which wouldn't happen at DreamWorks. And Vivo plays with its animation the same way Mitchell's and Spider-Verse do. By knowing the patterns, you can deduce which studio a movie belongs to, even when it doesn't quite match the archetype exactly. So, going back to Wreck-It Ralph, if it were a Pixar film, how would it be different? I think it would be less hard, with much less sarcasm. The relationship between Ralph and Vanellope would be played up to be more parental, or more like an older brother and little sister, and the rules of the world would feel more consistent. No, he messed with her code coming out of nowhere. Why can King Candy do that? That's stupid. The emotional moments wouldn't be a side effect of the adventure. The adventure would be designed to facilitate the emotional core. And by this same logic, can I predict what Illumination's Super Mario movie, at time of writing unreleased and with no trailers, is going to be like? Well, my money's on it's going to be very comedic, but with a swing or two at an emotional moment that won't hit especially hard. The cast characters will be played as an ensemble, not just a supporting cast for Mario. The focus will be divided fairly equally among them. The plot will have very zany twists and turns, and the characters are probably going to have smaller pupils. And one or two of them will be shaped like an 8. And finally, if DreamWorks' B-movie is hard, individualist, farcical, and ugly, what would Pixar's B-movie look like?
Coming this summer from Walt Disney and Pixar, Bee Story. Meet Barry, a worker bee tasked with collecting pollen from the beautiful countryside of Maine. When Barry leaves the hive for the very first time, he'll meet Victoria, a lost little girl who's terrified of bees. But with Barry's help, she'll learn that bees get scared, worried, and excited just like her. As Barry tries to help Victoria get home to her family and protects her from the dangers of the outside world, the two will build an unbreakable bond. But all good things must come to an end, and when they finally have to say goodbye, you're totally gonna cry about it. Bee Story.
Alright. I'm recording a video. I'm recording a video.
Oh, that was you. Oh, I thought you were talking to me.
Well, I was saying alright because I could hear you coming up the stairs.
So you were talking to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. You get that. I'll make you a burger.
Right.